Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Button Willow Raceway. We are here with this, the KTM 890 Duke R. I've already done a review of this bike in particular. It was a really quick street ride. Didn't really get to have a chance to really flog it thoroughly, and definitely didn't get to come to a racetrack. You can find that review. There's a link somewhere up here, or just go search the videos. It's right there. $11,699, I think the price is, under 12. And for that price, you get one hell of a motorcycle. This 890 engine is just a screamer of an engine. It's powerful, it's fun to ride. All the accolades you can imagine, this little package has it. But you could say this bike exists because it wants to take another bike on head-to-head. And in that regard, that's what we're here to do, because standing next to me right there, Triumph Street Triple RS and Ryan Adams. The long-standing king of the middleweight naked bike class, the Street Triple is and has long been just one hell of a motorcycle, and we've said just as much on these Mo YouTube page. It's a cool bike. The 3-cylinder engine wails. It sounds great. It's a lot of fun to ride. Great suspension, great chassis. You know, take a Daytona 675, strip the plastics off, put a 765 engine into it, and it's a recipe for fun. The RS has the Öhlins shock, a little bit better fork, a couple trick doodads here and there. But this new kid on the block, the KTM, has the Triumph straight in its sights. It costs about $800 less than the Triumph. And Ryan, what we've come to do here is just to see which bike really is better. We've taken both bikes on the street. Now we're here at Button Willow to see what they can do on the racetrack. Let's back up a bit and talk about the street. Ryan, what are your initial impressions about each bike on the street?
I think for a street ride, I really like the Triumph a lot. It's just super smooth engine. The quick shifter works very well, quite a bit better than the KTM, especially at low RPM. So that was nice. And it works really well. I kind of was a little bit surprised about how today kind of panned out at the racetrack, because I loved this thing so much on the street. And what I thought it might be like versus the KTM here was actually a little bit more of a surprise to me than I thought.
In my opinion, that Triumph, the looks of it is getting kind of dated, especially when you got this insect-looking KTM right here.
Yeah.
But I got to agree that quick shifter on the Triumph is excellent. We put both bikes on the Dyno, and it's amazing. They make nearly exactly the same power, 116. I think it's 116.7 on the Triumph and 116.2 with the KTM. Almost identical. Torque-wise, the KTM makes 70 pound-feet, the Triumph makes 56. But take a look at the dyno chart. You'll see the KTM makes more power than the Triumph everywhere until the KTM runs out of RPM. And then the Triumph takes over and makes up the power there. And you feel that when you ride both bikes too. On the street, on the racetrack. Down low, the Triumph is kind of laggy, kind of lugs along.
Totally.
And especially when you hop back on the KTM, you feel that power difference right away.
Yeah.
And that power difference is the KTM just makes more power than the Triumph pretty much throughout its rev range. And so it leaps out of corners way harder than the Triumph. And it just feels way more fierce and aggressive once you get on the power, and in a good way too. They're only separated in weight by about 8 pounds.
Yep.
But when you actually ride the bike, the KTM, in my opinion, feels way lighter than that.
Yeah, no, I agree. We do have to keep in mind that that is about 100 cc's almost bigger engine.
True.
So there is that. Obviously, it's a different engine layout too. So there are characteristics that are going to be, of course, that thing's super torquey.
Yeah.
And it's bigger. So,
Yeah.
it's pretty noticeable.
Oh, my original point was talking about the street. To me, the Street Triple, the Ergos, it's a really cushy seat, but the pegs are a lot higher compared to the KTM.
Yeah.
And for me, it put me in this weird upright position to where on the freeway I felt like a sail, a little bit. KTM, the pegs are low, the seat is pretty thin and hard, but I can go down the freeway and not feel like a sail in the wind.
You feel like you're a little bit more leaned over.
A little bit more leaned over and just cutting the wind a little bit better. Here on the racetrack, I thought for sure the KTM was going to be my bike, because on the street, I want the KTM over the Triumph. On the track, where you're revving the crap out of both bikes, that's where the Triumph's power advantage, rev ceiling advantage really kicks in.
Yeah.
And the decision's not quite so clear to me.
No, and honestly, I thought I kind of had my ideas together about what I thought of both of these bikes on the street after our street ride, and then we came here, kind of threw me for a loop, and now I'm wanting to get back out on the street and spend a little bit more time on it because they're both really great bikes, but they really do work so differently.
Yeah.
They produce power so much differently that, you know,
Right.
the brakes are great on both, but, you know, there are differences in the feel at the lever, and yeah, there are so many things. And it's not so much that there are so many, you know, this is bad here and this is good here. It's like they're both really good.
At different things.
Yeah, and it's like, how do you want it? You know,
Yeah.
do you want that punchy torque? Do you want a really firm brake lever? Do you want a little bit more maybe modulation with them? Thankfully, you know, you have a lot of adjustment with these, but yeah, there are a lot of differences for sure.
I do like the KTM. You can adjust the electronics. There's a lot more range of adjustment for the electronics on the KTM than you get on the Triumph. The most noticeable is traction control. You can actually adjust between 8 different levels.
On the fly too.
On the
in track
fly,
mode.
just boom, boom, press the button. The Triumph, you're stuck in preset modes. It's all tied to different riding modes.
Right.
You can't change that. So that's kind of annoying, and there were times where I actually felt it kick in. I could see the little
Constantly.
the light on the screen flashing, and I'm like,
Right.
why? We're doing fine.
Yeah.
And then, because the Triumph doesn't have an IMU-enabled TC system, the TC, when it kicks on, it really cuts back the power, and then once it feels like you have enough traction, it really packs the punch back in once it allows full power to be re-engaged. It almost feels like your bike has a turbo. There's one set of power parameters in one spot, like you have so much power, and then boom, like the turbo lag goes away and you get full power. That's kind of how the Triumph feels when its TC finally decides to give you all the power back. It's just the sudden rush of power. The KTM, when the TC intervenes, it's much more subtle because it does have an IMU and it does have more of a brain to calculate how much slip and lean angle is going on. And so it'll throttle back some power if it needs to, but it'll throttle some back in. It's a lot more seamless and linear application of TC. From that point of view, the KTM excels, but like I said, I thought I had my bike down, and being here at the racetrack has kind of thrown everything for a loop.
That's kind of a brief summary of our time spent on these bikes, but after the time that we had on the street and then this time at the track, I think we need to kind of sit down and try to digest our thoughts a little bit more.
Yeah, they both do great things, but they're very different great things, which makes no sense and makes total sense at the same time.
Sorry, it's confusing.
It's very confusing. So with all that said, the winner of this comparison is... Well, the winner isn't as obvious as we thought it was going to be at the end of our racetrack session, which is why we did a very unusual thing and we actually thought about it. We went home and had a sleep on it. I wrote down some notes. I hope Ryan did too. It is now 2 days after we rode the bikes at the racetrack. And I think this time, I know for me personally, this time has helped me really think about both bikes, because as we said at the racetrack, both bikes do a lot of good things, but very differently in very different ways. For example, we've said this before, but the Triumph's quick shifter and transmission is top notch. Like, it is so slick between gear to gear, especially that first, second gear change. It is so good. The other area where the Triumph excels is mid-corner stability. Now, both bikes have fully adjustable suspension. The Triumph has a Showa BPF fork in the front and an Öhlins shock in the back, and the KTM has WP Apex fully adjustable suspension front and rear. But just that chassis on the Triumph, once you get the bike mid-corner and you're leaned over and just railing through a corner, it's much more composed through that corner than the KTM. The KTM will flick into a corner pretty easily, especially thanks to those wide bars it has. But once you get mid-corner, compared to the Triumph, it's just not quite as stable once you're leaned over. But we're picking hairs here. They're both really really good once you're on the side. But then maybe the bigger advantage the KTM has over the Triumph is in the brakes. KTM has 320 millimeter discs, the Triumph has 310. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it really is. The KTM has the Brembo Stylema calipers, the Triumph has the M50 calipers. Both are amazing pieces, and really there's not much of a difference that the average person's gonna feel. We sure as hell didn't. Both have the same adjustable master cylinder, the 19 RCS master cylinder. You can change the leverage ratio with the RCS master cylinder, so it's really cool depending on whether you want some more progressive travel on your lever or if you want all the brakes right then and there. You can do that on both bikes. So the real difference here is the size of the brake discs, and the KTM has a bigger 10 mil bigger discs. Again, doesn't sound like much, but oh boy, once you get on the binders, that KTM stops with so much linearity, so much power. It's so good on the brakes. The Triumph isn't bad, and if the KTM weren't here, we wouldn't know the difference, but back to back, you can feel that difference in braking. It's quite astonishing. I already said up front, for a street bike, this KTM is hands down my pick between the two of them. But the racetrack, having the ability to use the Triumph's top end was really exciting. It sounds great, you get on the power, you get it up revving, and it's exciting. It's a very exciting bike to ride. I mean, you gotta remember, both bikes make 116 horsepower, so it's not like one bike will walk away from the other in the power department. Where you really feel the KTM's advantage is coming out of corners, whether on the street or on the racetrack. It's just so much easier to ride the KTM faster. The Triumph, you can definitely do it, but you got to keep the revs up to stay in the wake of the KTM. So it just takes a little bit more effort to keep that Triumph in that sweet spot of the power band. The KTM doesn't rev as high, so you're shifting more often than the Triumph, but you're leaping out of corners better than you are on the Triumph. And so you get that rush, you get that leap. You know, that's a big difference in how they make their power and how that applies in reality. To the track, to the street, KTM leaps out of corners, the Triumph likes to be revved up high. But the more I thought about it, just the more comfortable I felt going fast on the KTM. The downside with the KTM is the open cockpit that I liked on the street gives me nothing to really hang on to when you're really pushing it on a racetrack. The Triumph, meanwhile, on the street, that closed off cockpit made me feel a little, I don't want to say claustrophobic, but it felt tight. But on a racetrack, that's what I wanted, to, you know, latch on, to put my knees on the tank, to latch myself into turns and whatnot. I can go on, but I think I should probably let Ryan have a turn to talk about the things he liked and disliked about both bikes also. So Ryan, you thought about this some more. What's your takeaway from this?
I kind of enjoyed the KTM on the track a little bit more, interestingly enough. I mean, we're at much different levels of our track riding abilities. Me being the more experienced one, or the more novice one. But I really liked how much I could kind of move around and hang off of the KTM, and I just felt like I had all that room that really allowed me to do that. The kind of tight cockpit on the Street Triple RS made me feel a little bit more claustrophobic on the racetrack, just as it does on the street. Again, it's not something that is like a deal breaker by any means with this bike, but I kind of like the openness of the 890 on the street because it's not going to cramp you up as long if you want to take it on a little bit of touring duty. But then also on the racetrack, I kind of preferred the open position because I felt like I could just move around a little bit easier on it. I had the opportunity to test the 790 back-to-back with the 890 Duke R, and I think if the 790 was sitting here next to the Triumph Street Triple, I wouldn't be so quick to pick the KTM. So kudos to them, to KTM, for what they've done in ergonomics for the 890 Duke R. It just worked a lot better for me on the track, and I enjoyed it on the street too.
So usually we do our big reveal, the big winner at the end of these things. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and say the overall bike I would choose between the Triumph Street Triple RS and the KTM 890 Duke R would be the KTM 890 Duke R. This is my big winner from this whole test, and that wasn't so easy for me to decide at the end of our track day. As I've already said a million times, for a street bike, I love the KTM. but the imperfect feeling of the KTM was really on off. If you're really paying attention to things, it wasn't as smooth as it could have been. The transmission is by far the weak point of this KTM 890 Duke. Feels agricultural, really notchy, and not the smoothest thing in the world. So I should mention, this is the second KTM 890 Duke we've had in our possession. The first one we had a really notchy and really rough transmission that was really hard to shift. This one is worlds better, but neither of them hold a candle to the Triumph, and it's super slick quick shifter up and down. Before we go any further though, there's a few things I need to mention. One, both KTMs we've had are pre-production motorcycles. KTM tells us the transmission fix is due to software in the quick shifter that bikes that are in dealerships have already gone through. And then, most importantly, it's not an issue with the gears or the shift forks in the transmission itself. It's definitely software related in the quick shifter. And how do I know this? I rode Evans's 790 Duke with the same transmission and same quick shifter. I didn't crash the boss's bike. That's good. And that one's buttery smooth. So it was definitely something to do with software related issues with the quick shifter itself and not an overall reflection of the bike. That's really important to nail down. So knowing that made me feel much more at ease picking the KTM as my winner for both street and track, because the major issue, the transmission, is easily fixable. The other thing I didn't like was the mediocre fueling on the KTM. And again, riding Evans's 790 with a power commander on it, the difference in the fueling is night and day. That is very crisp. So knowing that the transmission and the fueling are pretty easy fixes, pretty much sealed the deal for me. The KTM is my pick. Which then throws me over to Ryan.
Yeah.
How do you feel about all of this?
Well, again, you know, it was hard to decide at the end of our track day, and after having some time on the street with them, and then getting a little bit more time with the KTM on the street. But if it's my money, you know, if I'm going to go out and buy one of these bikes, it's going to be the KTM. And it's mostly because it's so much more up to date. Its electronics are, you can tweak the electronics a little bit more. I love the brakes on the bike, the suspension, you know, we kind of got dialed in at the track. The two things that you mentioned are probably the two things that bothered me the most too. And knowing that they're, you know, you can iron those out, it kind of takes care of the niggles that I had with it. So it you know, I almost feel bad standing here next to the Street Triple saying this, because this is such a good bike too. The motor's awesome. I've always loved triple engines, and this bike has a lot of great components on it, and it works really good. You know, so it's kind of like splitting hairs here, because they're both great bikes. The motors are very different. You know, so if you're looking for something smoother that's going to have more top end, the RS is the bike. But if you want that punchy torque of the 890 Duke R, it gives it to you in spades, you know. So that's a lot of fun around town. It's a lot of fun on a tight track. Like, you know, it's just a blast. That being said, it's also, I mean, again, you can tune with the electronics, but it's a serious motorcycle. You know, if you just whack the throttle on that, I was in fifth gear on the freeway, and a little rise in the pavement, the front end got light. I was like, holy.
You meant to do that.
It's crazy though. I mean, it's got all that torque, and it's a lot of fun, but for an unexperienced rider, it's gonna be kind of a handful. So if you're newer, I don't know that I would recommend that, because it's got so much punch out of it. If you're not, especially with the fueling the way it is, if you're not making it really smooth, then it can be a bit of a handful. But for me, I love it. That's one of the reasons I like it.
Yeah.
And I love the styling. You mentioned before, there are things on this bike, the paint, some of the finishing details that Triumph has really stepped up, like in recent years, across all of their model range. And it looks really nice, but as far as styling, it is a little bit dated. I'm just a fan of the angular design on the KTMs, you know, and it's bright. I like the orange wheels. I like the orange frame. You know, that's kind of up to you, obviously, but everything considered, yeah, I'd pick the 890 Duke R.
I'm on the same boat for pretty much all the same reasons you just said. Also helps the KTM's cheaper.
Yeah,
So
and then there's that.
There's that. But it's worth stressing again, that Triumph, if that's your flavor, if you like the way that looks, it's a damn good motorcycle still. Ryan and I we've been overcome by the new kid on the block, and it's a damn good motorcycle. So there you have it. We picked the KTM. You definitely cannot go wrong if you pick the Triumph, though. That is a hell of a motorcycle. Either way, whichever bike you pick, you're a winner. With that in mind, be sure to go to Motorcycle.com, read the full review there. And yeah, this was harder than it looks, but someone's got to do it, and thankfully it's us. So anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you later.
Did you get your check from KTM yet for saying all those nice things, or?
You
still waiting?
It might have gotten crossed in the mail with the Triumph check.
Okay, cool.
So I don't know. And the post office is really hurting for cash these days.
Right.
So they might have,
I could have. Yeah.
I know, because someone
Stick
on
your
YouTube
fingers.
land's gonna be like, "You guys just get paid off by the manufacturer
Yeah,
for
well,
saying nice things about them."
Gotta get some advertising dollars somewhere, right? That's well placed. Alpine Star suit in the background.
And a rye.
Yeah.
And an EX500 engine.
This AGV tattoo that I have.
Across your forehead.
Yeah.
Oh man.